Crooked Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton lost. Remember the insurance policy. He thought that Hillary Clinton, when Crooked Hillary said the free pass they gave to Hillary used the word deplorables. I think Hillary Clinton.
No, we are not about to head into the 2016 campaign again. And no, Hillary Clinton is not running in 2020. But President Trump could not hold back his attack against his former rival, now private citizen, during the official launch of his re-election campaign last night in Orlando, Florida. So let's go straight to Florida, where NBC's Peter Alexander is standing by. Peter, this was a rerun, a repeat, or one could say President Trump's greatest hits. He seemed to focus more on past grudges than a vision for the future.
Yeah, Stephanie, I think you're exactly right. It certainly in many ways did feel a lot like the 2016 campaign never ended for President Trump. Last night airing a lot of those familiar grievances, attacking those same familiar targets, his perceived enemies, Hillary Clinton, the media, the Democrats, the establishment. One of the real challenges for the president this time around, who some last night compared to being sort of like an aging rock star who was replaying those greatest hits. Again, the lock her up chants you heard, the build the wall, the drain the swamp. All the familiar language is how do you sort of re-energize the crowd going forward? It's clear that the 2020 strategy is less about persuading new voters going into next year's election, really more about supercharging his loyal base. And there is a strong base. We saw it again last night, a capacity crowd, about 20,000 people here at the Amway Center, home of the Orlando Magic. But over the course of an hour and 15 minutes, the crowd even kind of grew a little bit tired. The seats were starting to get a little bit empty toward the end of his event. A lot of the red hats out there, but the blue seats peering through as well. It was an important event for the campaign, though, in terms of its energy. They were able to fundraise. The RNC reporting today that more than $24 million have now been raised by Donald Trump in the last 24 hours. They vacuumed up a lot of voter data, that critical information, especially as it relates to Florida voters, a state that this campaign is heavily focused on. They get their emails, their phone numbers, and also their intensity. So these are people they can re-engage as the election draws closer. But Stephanie, you're right. Exactly what struck me is what you were just noting right there. The president, with not a lot of new messaging and not a lot of new material, still focusing on a lot of the same familiar themes.
All right, Peter Alexander, thank you so much. I want to dig deeper into this. Joining us now, NBC News national political reporter Jonathan Allen, Democratic strategist Chris Kofinis, and senior political correspondent for The Hill, Amie Parnes. Mr. Allen, to you first. Your big takeaway last night was this wasn't red versus blue. It was us versus them. If the chants were build the wall, we had a Republican-controlled Congress, and the wall didn't get built. If it's drain the swamp, the president's in charge of the swamp. And if it's lock her up, Hillary Clinton has nothing to do with running the country now or in 2020. How is that an us versus them?
Well, he's basically running what you would look at as almost like a revival meeting. This is sort of, as Peter was saying, a rallying of the base. What they're trying to do, Stephanie, is in a presidential election, maybe half the people who are eligible are going to vote. And what they're trying to do, they know they aren't able to persuade a whole lot of people who disagree with Trump to switch sides. His approval ratings have been inelastic. So what they're trying to do is find people who agree with him who don't vote and get them out. And one of the ways they do that is they hold these rallies. They get a lot of people to sign up for them. They supercharge those folks while they're in there and try to get them to go out and spread the word, basically create reinforcements for the base. And that's what you heard last night. And that's why he went to those old familiar themes, those calls and responses that you were talking about, lock her up, drain the swamp, build the wall. Almost nothing new last night except for going from Make America Great Again to Keep America Great.
Amie, I want to share how the New York Times described the rally. They write this. He extolled his record as president, the growing economy, the tax cuts and deregulation, but did not offer any new policies or a cohesive agenda for a second term that might expand his political appeal. No offense, but why would he? The president never led with policies when he was running or since he's in office, and He's the one who knows how he got into the White House. Why would he change his game?
Exactly. And he knows 2016 was the best thing that could have happened to him. He won out of nowhere. People never expected it. He kind of wants to relive that moment. So actually talking about these themes going back to 2016 is why he feels like he's so invigorated, because he feels like that's what people wanted back then. This is what people want now. They feel invigorated when they hear "lock her up." That is, his homecoming chant, if you will. And so he wanted more of this. He will continue to do this. I think you saw him attack President Obama last night. He's going to continue. If Biden remains the front runner, he will continue to talk about Obama-Biden and how bad Biden is for, the economy and everything else. And this is sort of where he's going, I think.
Chris, you're a Democratic strategist. For all of those running who watched the president last night, it's a preview of what is to expect in his campaign. How do they respond as he is painting the Democrats as far-left loons?
Well, I mean, it tells you a couple things. One, I would say it's going to be obviously a very brutal, nasty race, even more negative than the last presidential. The second thing I think it tells you is that the Trump strategy really is about re-energizing the base. It's kind of the playbook that Bush used in 2004. They've come to the conclusion that they cannot expand their voting support. That's probably true. So they got to bring out as many Republicans and Trump supporters as they can. I think the Democrat strategy is not to play into the trap to make this only about Trump. Obviously, you got to be the foil. You got to expose, I think, the fallacies, the failures, the hypocrisies, and all the other things that he's done. But you really, I think, got to focus on that middle part of the country. And I'm not talking about ideologically. I'm talking about the middle part of the country where those voters may not be thinking about, should I come out and vote? I'm tired of this political game, but do want the country to move forward in a positive way. So in a weird way, the Democrats have a little bit more of a challenge because they got to walk the line of energizing their base, attacking Trump, but also kind of providing a more positive, inspirational vision, whereas Trump has given up on the inspirational vision. He's just going to attack.
Then don't Democrats need to focus hard, Jonathan, on the economy? Because we hear from Trump supporters or even people who are nonplussed about him who say, listen, my life is better or deregulation helps me. I didn't vote for a preacher. I just want to be sure I can take care of my family. Isn't the Democrats' job here is to unmask that, to show how the economy hasn't worked for everyone and how his promises have not been fulfilled?
It's really a tricky bind for them, Stephanie. As you point out, a lot of people feel like the economy is doing well, in part because the president's been selling it as doing well, in part because the numbers they see at the macro level are really good. Unemployment is down. Economic growth has been good, a continuation from Obama's many months of consecutive economic growth. And the challenge there is to run against an economy that people keep hearing is good and in some cases feel is good. But a lot of those folks don't feel the economy is good, and it's a much more nuanced message. And unless the Democrats focus on making that case, they won't be able to do it. There is some history behind that, though. Donald Trump ran against a reasonably growing and reasonably stable and strong Obama economy to become president. And in 1992, Bill Clinton ran against a George H.W. Bush economy that was growing back out of recession and said, it's the economy, stupid. That was James Carville's line, I think. But that was the message that he ran on and was able to defeat the incumbent George H.W. Bush. So it's clearly not impossible.
Well, it's the same economy Obama had, a bifurcated one, working for some, not working for others. President Trump won, pointing out how broken it was. Can Democrats now do the same? Amy, we got to talk about Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, now dropping out of the running for Pentagon chief after these allegations surfaced of domestic violence in his family's past. I want to share what the president said.
I had heard about it yesterday for the first time. I didn't know about it. I had heard about it yesterday, and it's very unfortunate. Very unfortunate. No, we have a very good vetting process, and you take a look at our cabinet and our secretaries, very good. But we have a great vetting process.
All right, I want to share what Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post writes. 1, pick someone unqualified. 2, don't vet him. 3, let him twist in the wind until the press has it. 4, don't inform Congress. 5, withdraw and look like a bunch of clowns. Repeat. What are your sources telling you? Because we've seen this time and again, people up for the jobs, the vetting process doesn't seem to work out, and then they're out, humiliated.
It is. Everyone I've spoken to in the last couple days since yesterday has essentially said this is an embarrassment. People even close to the president are kind of cringing at this. They don't understand. It kind of highlights these bigger, it takes away from what they were trying to do. Of course, it's become a joke that they wanted to do infrastructure. All these gaffes along the way have taken away from the president's message and have, it's almost become a joke as to the vetting process. And I think it makes even people that work at the White House a little uncomfortable and squeamish at that.
And anyone saying, Shanahan, did you not see what happened to Rob Porter? Why put yourself in this position?
It beats me. I don't even know. I think a lot of people are kind of scratching their heads at this one.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.